Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of TU Stories. I'm your host, Adrian Battle Marston, and I work in the Office of Inclusion and Institutional Equity. And today we have another special guest with us here, and I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Cicada. I pronounce are, they, it. I'm a lecturer on campus and I mostly teach whatever I can, but I just got started a transgender communication class that I hope will be successful and interesting and fun. I'm currently the QSU advisor, Queer Student Union advisor, and
Nice,
I'm teaching a science, technology, and culture class that I
nice.
regretfully signed up for. I'm not a science teacher, but it's been really fun. We had a week on cyborg feminism. I was super stoked about that.
Mm,
And last week we did scientific racism, talked a lot about bones and bodies and how
yeah.
they've been used non-consensually. Yeah, it's
Mm,
been a challenging semester, but
yeah.
an interesting one.
We have an important date coming up, which is what we call International Pronouns Day. One of the things that we really wanted to highlight is a conversation on transgender people. There was definitely a shift in the exposure in sort of helping support trans people over the course of the last several years. Is there a place where we can sort of pinpoint that in terms of this is when the momentum of advocacy was really starting to blossom? And are there some people that we can look to and say they played a crucial role, particularly in understanding the value in pronouns and the life experiences that trans people are really going through?
So I think advocacy has a much longer history. It's often much easier to cite where things got worse or where
Mm-hmm.
things changed in a way that maybe required advocacy or changed what advocacy looked like. 2014 is the year that I think a number of people cite as the trans tipping point, the so-called trans tipping point, where you see uh, trans folk becoming more visible on like a mainstream level,
Mm.
a turn towards acceptance, but also this more like mainstream kind of wonder, which isn't always in acceptance and isn't always I guess polite or accepting
Yeah.
of people. I think it's also easier to cite the past few years. I forget exactly which year it was because it seems like every year seems to be this the highest number of bills put forward against trans people. It feels like every year has been kind of a record for us. But the
Mm-hmm.
past few years definitely have sort of seen the I guess the political backlash and with it a renewed kind of interest in advocacy. But advocacy has been, I mean, you could cite all the way back to, the 1960s, at least of like a more like main, I don't know, on the main resistance towards how trans folk and queer folk in general have been treated.
Social media, rightfully so, has a lot of criticism that sort of gets thrown
Hmm.
on it. But even in my own personal experience, I learned a lot about the queer community, particularly from the voices that were able to create platforms on these apps like Twitter, like Instagram, even now with TikTok. How has like social media really helped to kind of amplify these voices in a way that I don't know we've ever seen on that scale, just due to like things being able to go viral in a way, you know?
Yeah, I think it's that social part. It's the development of community.
Mm,
Um, it, this is like a part of like if you want to talk about like tipping points, like a tipping point towards internet, online communities, connectivity that goes beyond just the people around you. Um, I mean, trans folk exist, but we are a minority, so
yeah.
it's very hard to connect with people, especially if you don't have access to those kind of online platforms. Some scholars, Oliver Hameson comes to mind, talk about some social media sites or platforms as trans technologies, as in they're kind of ways to reconstruct ourselves and represent ourselves. They become ways to share information that isn't readily available,
Yeah.
ways to maybe seek some kind of medical transition uh, without a supportive medical system, ways to support yourself in, I mean, your social circles, romantic circles, right? Family circles, advocate for yourself. And also ways to represent yourself, which I think kind of comes back to that idea of pronouns, because how we are allowed to represent ourselves online is maybe a big question right now.
Earlier on, you mentioned, the idea of more state legislation has sort of been passed almost at like an exponential rate. In my personal experience, that spike, it's hard for me to pinpoint where that's stemming from. In your own experience, where do you think that is rooted in? And there's always been bigotry, but the last several years, I've definitely seen a shift, particularly, let's say, politicians were not using that as like a a talking point to gain like political capital, right? That wasn't anything there, but culture wars has sort of become like the norm in a lot of, political
Mm-hmm.
conversations, particularly with trans people. And I know that one of the things that we definitely talked about was this narrative of like, what is a woman? Like, can you
Mm.
define what a woman is?
Right. I think maybe the most famous example, I believe his name is Matt Walsh, who put out a kind of documentary that's
Yes.
often cited as the like what is a woman moment, going around interviewing people to define what is a woman. And I think what's really fascinating about those moments is, for one, it is like this gotcha moment, right? Because it's
Mm-hmm.
meant to kind of index this simplicity, this kind of like, well, trans folk are complicating something, or they're not educated on gender and not educated in a way that they don't understand this basic foundational fact of what like gender or sex is.
Yeah.
Uh, and I also love those moments because, for one, we are complicating gender in a lot of ways and have been used to complicate gender. And I guess another part of that is it's a very good question, because whether he knows it or not, or whether those folk know it or not, asking something like, what is a woman, does get to a lot of basic ideas in our society that we kind of fall for, that we just sort of
Mm-hmm.
assume, that we feel we have some kind of authority, right? Many of the people who answer those questions or ask those questions tend to refer to biology,
Yeah.
despite the fact that generally the scientific consensus is sex and gender are more complicated than a gender binary or a sex binary. Um, One of my favorite questions to ask my students is what defines sex for them. This is like this is not me, my original thought. This is an old kind of exercise, where of course people mention genitalia, and then you have like the really good student who's very curious and says, but wait a minute, what about hormones? And then
Yeah.
someone says, well, yeah, but there's also secondary sex characteristics. And someone says, oh, but isn't it in your genetics?
Mm.
And it becomes this kind of spiraling conversation of, yeah, maybe there is a complicated answer to that question of what is a woman.
Yeah.
More complicated than I think Matt Walsh really accepts.
One of the things that I know we shared, we talked about a little bit beforehand of there are like cishet women who
Mm,
cannot have, periods, menstrual cycles. They cannot, reproduce under, the sort of normal way that people sort of look
mm,
at reproduction.
mm,
If you remove those things that are often cited as you sort of go to checklist categories that are
mm,
necessary that will define a person as
mhm,
a woman, you're also excluding people that are not always in the LGBTQ plus community, right? And
mhm,
so I think that leads into some of the things that we talked about, which is I think many people are trying to define what womanhood is without fully knowing what it's like for cishet people also.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, talking about like mastectomies, right?
Yeah.
Or people who are older and can no longer have a child, right? People who've been subject to cancer or other kinds
Mm.
of disorders, right? Who may not bear a lot of those characteristics. I think one of the, I mean, funny but also worst ironies of the kind of transphobic movement has been those instances where cisgender heterosexual women are interpreted as trans,
Yes.
and receive their own kind of hate. And of course, they're sitting there going, I'm not trans. Why are you doing
Right.
this?" Um, I think it also reveals just how little the people who like refer to these kind of common sense arguments, just how little they know and how little they care to actually know what these experiences are.
Mm.
I have a trans masculine friend. He's doing like a lot of really great work over at UMBC, and he often gets mistaken as a trans woman, um because of these kind of like problems of perception around transness. Yeah, it's terribly complicated, and these kind of movements to simplify it, they just don't work.
It sort of leads to one of the other areas that we sort of touched on, which is the idea, that term like woke has sort of become this all
Hmm. Hmm.
encompassing idea.
Hmm.
And a common talking point is that these new concepts of structural barriers and deep rooted ideas of bigotry are these new sort of talking points that are sort of created
Hmm.
for like political capital, right?
Hmm.
And one of the things that we sort of touched on was like, no, these ideas have been around for a very long
Hmm.
time.
Hmm.
They've just been presented in a particular light, right? And so we talked about
Hmm.
things in film, and I remember, like so, like I'm obviously disclaimer for people that don't know me, I'm like a huge film comic book nerd, right? So there are moments where like I'll binge through all of the MCU
Hmm.
films. And I
Hmm.
remember sitting there next to my wife where there was a clear trans joke made in the first Iron Man. And I remember seeing like, oh, just like cringed
Yeah.
because back in 2008, that went right over my head
Hmm.
as like a normal sort of
Hmm.
joke that is often perpetuated in media. I
Hmm.
remember moments like this would happen in comedy shows
Hmm.
like Friends, Fresh Prince. These things would happen in, shows like How I Met Your
Hmm.
Mother,
Hmm.
where at the time it is so normalized that you're only taught to see that in one way.
I think the thing that you're getting at that I think about a lot across my classes is how we're managing like how old things are or how historical things are. We like to treat the movement towards certain kinds of pronouns as like new. Gender neutral pronouns have been around for a god awful long time.
Yeah.
They're not new. And the people who say that they're new or that they aren't helpful or useful or just like frivolous or whatnot are exactly the people who are using them. You use them. I use them. We're always using them. Um, I think a lot about you're talking about like wokeness, right? And part of that idea of wokeness, as it's used in a pejorative sense, is to talk about like people who are bringing something up that we thought was settled, right? It's a very generic example or definition. Um, like that, we can talk about that for transness, we can talk about that for race, we could talk about that for disability, any number of I think
Mm-hmm.
factors, right? This idea of, oh, well, now the gay people want to dress different. as though that gender binary is like the end all be all and has been around forever, and as though it's not some kind of Western white norm.
The shift can be jarring
Mm-hmm.
if you're not noticing the biases you have about a particular community. I don't always think people who carry an identity that has advantages, I don't always think they see their representation as a political statement.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when that is often shifted away, that is when they can sometimes see things as political, as opposed to looking at, all right, if we were to track the protagonist in films and TV shows and video games over the last like 75
Mm-hmm.
years,
Mm-hmm.
how many of them could you relate to and how many of them could you not? And the overwhelmingly majority of them would be on your side, even to this day.
Yeah, it's like you're taking away just a modicum of like power from someone, and suddenly that becomes this like a world shifting event, right? The
Yeah.
Starfield example is great. The like screaming about how transness and pronouns and all this other gender stuff is infecting everything. I believe is some of the language that he used, and I think that's like strangely enough a really good metaphor, because to say something's infecting something is to say that there's this like proper and natural and healthy body and that something is invading it, right?
Yeah.
um, but what they don't realize, or maybe what they do realize, they don't want to say, I don't want to say the quiet part loud, is that that body has been white, and that body has been male, and that body has been cisgender, and that body has been heterosexual, and that body has been able-bodied, right? That body has been neurotypical. You could go on and on.
Is there a way to properly represent particularly trans people in film and in TV shows and media in general? Because I have seen there have been instances where people have made efforts, perhaps with good intentions, and I don't know if they always notice the negative impact that come due to maybe blind spots that they probably haven't
Mm,
noticed. In your view, how can we sort of navigate through that so that
mm.
it's affirming, it's educational, it's a loving experience?
Yeah, yeah. There's maybe two answers to that. The first one, the
Hmm.
easy one, is the bar is low. The bar is horribly low, and the fact that people still trip over it is wild to me. It, I mean, I guess first of all, to step over that bar, do away with disgust, right? Do away with the kind of horror of trans experience. Uh, the more complicated answer, I think, and I say complicated because it's complicated for trans people, and I think this maybe extends to a lot of marginalized people too, where we find ourselves in this trap of we want we don't want to still engage with like those if you want to talk about wokeness, like the trauma narratives. I don't need to watch a 2 hour film on transphobia. I live it.
Yeah.
I don't need to experience that. Thank you. I know the history. I know the figures. They're not great. And so navigating that on one end, and on the other end, the complete opposite, which is just total invisibility. The people who say like, that person is trans. I wrote them as trans. The kind of J.K. Rowling effect,
Oh
right?
my goodness.
That's a whole other conversation. But the sort of, yeah, this person is trans and we're not going to talk about it. And I think at the heart of that is this question of what visibility looks like. Whether we are kind of sacrificing invisibility when we like hyper focus on trauma, and whether we're sacrificing the kind of uh, hyper visibility when we are focusing on, just this character that is trans in description only, right?
Yeah.
I think there has to be a way to navigate those two things. There has to be a way to say, I want a character who I can feel something about. I can identify with them. I can see myself in them. I can see my experiences in them. and not at the same time have to see that character beaten or bloodied,
Mm,
or to see, or to just not see that character, to not know that I'm identifying with that character. One of the best examples, talked about video games earlier. Celeste is a video game that got a lot of attention in the past half decade or so. And the creator, or one of the creators of that game, did not know she was trans as she was developing it. So
mm,
there's a lot of these feelings of being trans are encoded in the game, but the character itself that you play is not like strictly identified as trans, at least not until the DLC. So, and even then, it's just kind of like images, it's just kind of hints. And I don't hate that representation. I like the feeling of, this feels trans to me. This feels
mm.
like my experience. I identify with this character's struggles. And even if it's not explicitly about transness, I see a character literally trying to climb a mountain, facing herself, another version of herself, uncomfortable truths about herself, trying to reach that peak for no one but for herself,
Yeah.
and for who she wants to be.
That sort of reminded me of a couple of examples in just, the representation, like the educational component of, like, the typical guy's in a bar and he doesn't realize that the
Mhm.
person he's having maybe like a sexual encounter with
Yeah.
is transgender, or like the queer coding that can sometimes
Hmm.
exist in films where, like, it's kind of like a wink and a nod that there might be
Hmm.
something there,
Hmm.
but you don't want to go too far.
Hmm.
And in all of those instances, I think there's some who there may be some malicious intent, and I do think others are maybe trying their best in maybe the spaces that they're in to try to be as inclusive without recognizing you might be doing more harm than good.
Hmm.
What are there some concerns with those examples that you see often, even to this day, in trans representation?
I think maybe one of the classic examples nowadays is Family Guy, or maybe as a classic, one of the more modern examples of a classic stereotype or classic trope, and that's the vomit trope. That maybe you're getting at, the guy who goes to the bar, picks up a woman, has sex with her, or comes close to having sex with her, and then there's the reveal.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, the
Yep.
first film, had this
Yep.
moment of, you find out this character is trans, and then the joke is that everyone in the room starts vomiting and like scraping their tongues, and you think, oh well, that was like what, 90s, somewhere around there. That's in the past. And then you have Family Guy with Brian, a dog, is sleeping with uh, Quagmire's dad, and referred to as dad, even though she's clearly transitioned. And there's a full minute long vomit scene. It's still here, it's still around.
Mm.
I think if there's maybe a good response to all of that, or like what kind of representation are we seeking, if that's the question. I think maybe a way to step aside that question is to say that we can make our own representation. I don't think mainstream media really is the answer.
Yeah.
I think a lot about tabletop communities. I think a lot about fan fiction. I think a lot about people who are doing the work of making their own trans characters and trans communities, and making their own stories rather than relying on Hollywood to do that work.
We want to land the plane here as we're sort of reaching that 30-minute mark. What do you think is fueling this almost new wave of sort of charge against trans people? And are there some gaps in the conversation that you think a lot of people are missing when it comes to this entire conversation that has been blown up, and you've got so many people sort of touching on opinions that may not always have the full scope of what it's like for a person that is trans?
Yeah, I would say that at maybe the heart of this is the idea of trans folk as kind of the new like marginalized, hyper visible kind of figure. That phrase that's like, I didn't speak up for this person, and then they came for me, right? This is kind of
Mm,
like going the opposite direction of like, oh well, it was queer people, so now we're moving more specifically to trans people, right? Um, I think at the heart of a lot of it is the same kind of discourses and ideologies. It's you see some of the same arguments about transness, and especially about that. The big example for me is bathrooms. These
yeah.
kind of arguments about threats to children, right? Or when we
Hmm.
talk about hormones and medical transitioning, which not every trans person wants to do. The conversation inevitably comes back again to like children, right? That's a common kind of thread. If you look at Greg Abbott's letter out of
Yeah.
Texas, you see a lot of conversation about like forced sterilization of children. He even had the audacity to cite forced sterilization of people of color, historical forced sterilization. And so I think maybe the big takeaway is that it's not new. It's all the same kinds of anger and the same kinds of anxieties that are piled up there. I'm someone who believes that educating someone is not that's not the best response. It takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of work. I mean, I'm
Hmm.
a teacher. I know how much work that takes and how little that often pays off. But at the same time, I have this voice inside my head that just says, "Dad, please read a book." Do any kind of educating yourself in a way that is actually critical, and I would maybe hesitate to say like literate of the controversies. The people who watch the whole Matt Walsh documentary stuff, right? Maybe talk to a trans person.
Yeah.
Maybe read something that is from our perspective instead of relying on the people who are, I mean, very actively working to doubt us and to undermine our lives, and deny us just the pleasure of just living.
What advice could you give to someone, maybe just on an individual level, on like a higher ed institution? Because we're, putting in the context
Hmm.
of us sort of being here on a university's campus.
Hmm.
What are some better ways that we can support the trans community on our campus?
I have maybe two responses to that. One is to cast aside any mindset that things can't change. And that is to me, and I say this as someone who works on this campus and who still receives mail or communication or anything that I might see with my dead name on it, or referring to me by the wrong pronouns, that systems can change. And if you are in charge of that system, or if you have a voice on campus to do that kind of work, to promote that kind of change, you can do that. That is something you can do. We don't have to accept how things have been built for us. There's a convenience there. It's not a good convenience for the people who don't have power. The second response that I have there is maybe a bit harder, I think, because it's an ugly truth that people don't want to face about marginalization, and that's you gotta hire us.
Mm,
You have got to give people a voice beyond just I don't know, publishing a quote by them, give someone a voice beyond just hosting them on like at like a conference or something. Hire us, pay us to
mm,
do things, put us on important committees to give you this kind of advice and structure, right?
yeah.
And I think the reason that's kind of an ugly truth is that people don't want to give up that kind of power. And it is always the hardest conversation to have at like an administrative level of we need to hire people who know about these people and who are not the people who have historically marginalized them. Um, I think that's the harder kind of, you talk about like allyship. There's another word, accomplice, right?
Mm.
Of doing this kind of work to actually give us some kind of position where we can do that work.
I want to make sure anyone that does watch or listen know some of the terms that we're using here. So, dead naming. Can you
Mm-hmm.
help us make sense out of dead naming and what that means?
Sure. So my name is Cicada. That's a chosen name. I have a legal name, as I have not done the what feels to me immense labor and resource cost of changing that name legally. So I have a legal name, and that legal name, which I was assigned at birth, is not a name that I identify with anymore. And so we refer to those kinds of names as debt names, as they're not the lived names that we use.
Last but not least, what is your favorite horror movie of all time?
Of all time,
I know that's a tall task. Oh my word, I shouldn't have done
that is a tall task.
it.
Gosh, there's so many. It is hard to say like favorite why. I think that's always the question for me. I think a lot about this film called Sleepaway Camp. It's also like a classic example. Spoiler alert, though it's been out for decades. It is a trans serial killer kind of tropey film,
Yeah.
and it's not a particularly famous one. But there's so much in that film about like the trouble of gender binaries and the trouble of sexual relations, and it's a really difficult film, both because it's really strange. It's just the acting is so odd, and the
I'm so
story behind,
curious.
yeah, the story behind it is so fat. There have been podcasts about this.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Dead Meat James on YouTube, who did kind of he does kill counts of
Got
horror
it.
movies.
Got
He
it.
did
Got it.
kind of a run on Sleepaway Camp, and it's really fascinating to me because it's a strange example of a trans feminine figure who enacts this kind of violence, but over the course of the movie, you realize a lot of that violence is kind of justified in a way. She's the subject of sexual abuse. She's the subject of, I mean, physical and emotional abuse at the hands of people who are at this camp. It's a camp film. So it's like that to me stands out to me
Mm.
as a favorite. I have many favorites, but I think a lot about that film, especially when I think about trans horror.
Cicada, thank you so much for your time. I very, very much enjoyed now my second conversation with you. It's been very enlightening, very refreshing, very informal and educating for me. And I hope our listeners walk away with a deeper sense of why representation is needed and important, and things to consider, and how we can support our trans friends in this community in a better way as we sort of continue to move forward.
Thank you, Adrian.
And for you all that are listening, if this is your first time, we thank you so much for tuning in, and we'd love it if you could hit that subscribe and notification button. And with that, thank you all again, and we will see you all next time. Peace.